Isabella had never known hardship. From the moment she could walk, the world had bent itself to her whims. The grand estate she called home was more than just a house. It was a palace of indulgence, where every corner whispered luxury and every servant anticipated her desires. She moved through life with an air of entitlement, her head held high, a delicate but unmistakable curl of superiority on her lips. Even in her youth, Isabella displayed an innate knack for commanding attention, though often not for reasons that earned genuine admiration. Friends and acquaintances alike were captivated not by her warmth or intellect, but by her wealth and the dazzling veneer of refinement she projected. Her daily life was a carefully curated display of opulence. She dressed in the finest silks and velvets, jewels sparkling with every gesture, and attended balls where her laughter rang above all others. Each compliment she received seemed to reinforce her belief in her own superiority, and each glance of envy or submission from others only confirmed her assumptions about her position in the world. Isabella was used to dictating how others behaved around her, whether it was instructing a servant on the proper way to fold her gowns or dismissing the advice of seasoned family friends. She was confident, proud, and utterly convinced of her right to live above the ordinary struggles of life. Yet beneath the glittering surface, Isabella's parents watched with growing concern. They had raised a daughter who was beautiful, intelligent, and capable, yet also haughty and selfish. Her charm, which might have been used to cultivate kindness or empathy, instead became a tool for manipulation and condescension. Her father, a stern but loving man, worried that her arrogance would alienate her from meaningful relationships, while her mother fretted over the impossibility of teaching her humility in a world where wealth shielded her from any consequence. The more they indulged her, the more they realized that Isabella's greatest flaw was not lack of talent or beauty, but a lack of perspective, a blindness to the value of respect, empathy, and hard work. Isabella's interactions with others reflected this imbalance. She regarded her peers with a mixture of impatience and disdain, particularly those who were not born into privilege. She mocked the servants with subtle barbs, praising their diligence while sneering at their simple lives, never truly recognizing their humanity. Even her friends, enamored with her social status, sometimes recoiled at the sharpness in her tone or the dismissive flick of her wrist. She believed that the world revolved around her whims, and those who did not comply were unworthy of her attention. To her, kindness was currency to be spent selectively, and respect was demanded rather than earned. However, the tension between Isabella's demeanor and her parents' concerns hinted that this golden cage of privilege might not last forever. Her parents began to whisper of ways to temper her arrogance, to give her a taste of life beyond the gilded walls she so comfortably inhabited. For Isabella, unaware of the brewing plan, life continued in its predictable rhythm of luxury and superficial admiration. But the seeds of change had been planted, and circumstances were about to challenge every assumption she had ever held about herself, her worth, and her place in the world. The heiress who believed she commanded life itself had yet to meet the force that would teach her that true respect and love could never be purchased, and humility, once embraced, could transform her in ways wealth never could. Isabella's parents, having endured years of their daughter's pride and insufferable arrogance, had reached a difficult but resolute decision. Their daughter was brilliant, beautiful, and blessed with immense privilege, but she lacked the one quality they considered essential: humility. They had tried subtle methods to temper her ego over the years, advising her with gentle warnings, orchestrating situations where she might see the struggles of others, even encouraging friendships with those less fortunate. But Isabella had ignored or manipulated every attempt. Each lesson had been shrugged off with a delicate roll of her eyes or a polite, condescending smile. Her parents realized that if she were ever to become a woman of substance, something drastic had to happen, something that would shake her sense of entitlement to its very core. The idea came to her father one evening as he observed Isabella hosting another lavish gathering in the grand ballroom of their estate. She floated through the crowd, her laughter light and musical, but it was the kind of laughter that demanded attention, often at the expense of others. Servants scurried about, attending to her every whim, while her friends nodded to her every word. The spectacle was beautiful, almost magical, but it was also painfully revealing. Isabella had never known real struggle, never faced someone who could meet her with patience rather than submission, never experienced the sting of being powerless. Her father understood, with growing clarity, that no amount of advice or reprimand could teach her what she needed to learn. He spoke with her mother in hushed tones, considering possibilities that would achieve what mere lectures could not. They needed a situation where Isabella could no longer rely on wealth or social status to define her existence. After much discussion, they settled on an unorthodox, radical idea: a marriage, not to a man of her own social standing, not to someone who would simply serve as a partner in luxury, but to Thomas, a loyal servant who had worked for the family for years. Thomas was respected among the household staff and known for his integrity, patience, and unwavering moral compass. He was a man of simple means, someone who had learned the value of hard work and who lived modestly, with dignity and strength. The parents believed that marrying Isabella to Thomas would confront her with a world she had never had to navigate, a world where respect had to be earned, not demanded, and where love and loyalty mattered far more than opulent clothing or sparkling jewels. In their minds, it was the perfect plan, a punishment disguised as an opportunity for growth. They were confident that the experience would humble her, teaching her lessons in empathy, gratitude, and the worth of character over material wealth. Of course, the parents understood that this plan would be met with fierce resistance. Isabella would be furious, mortified, and perhaps even rebellious. That reaction was anticipated. It was part of the process. The goal was not comfort but transformation. They began making preparations discreetly, coordinating with trusted household staff to avoid giving Isabella any clue. Invitations were prepared, legal arrangements quietly handled, and Thomas himself was informed with gentle honesty, though he had little say in the matter. He accepted with the quiet humility that defined him, understanding that his role was to support, not dominate, in this unexpected turn of events. Meanwhile, Isabella remained blissfully unaware. She continued her days in a bubble of wealth and admiration, unaware that her world was about to be shaken. For her parents, every step of the plan was guided by love, tempered by necessity, and rooted in a deep hope that their daughter would emerge not only humbled, but wiser, stronger, and capable of forming relationships based on mutual respect rather than social advantage. What they could not foresee, however, was that the changes this scheme would ignite were not limited to Isabella alone. Thomas, too, would find his life transformed in ways even he could not anticipate, setting the stage for events that would challenge assumptions, ignite unexpected emotions, and redefine the meaning of true partnership. If you want, I can continue with Part 3, the forced marriage, and expand it into another 600-word detailed narrative. This way, the story will continue to build organically. The day of the wedding arrived with an air of tense anticipation. Isabella awoke that morning dressed in silks that, though fine, were a modest contrast to the opulent gowns she was accustomed to wearing. Her parents had made the ceremony as simple as possible, stripping away the lavish pageantry that she so cherished. The grand hall of the estate, usually glittering with chandeliers and draped in silks and flowers, was now elegantly restrained, with only a handful of guests present, close relatives and essential staff. For Isabella, the understated setting felt like a humiliation. Every fiber of her being rebelled against it. She was a woman accustomed to admiration, to being the center of attention, and now she was being stripped of her pomp, forced to face a reality she had never had to confront. Thomas, the man she was to marry, waited at the altar with quiet dignity. His attire was simple, his expression calm, yet there was an unmistakable strength in the way he stood. He was a man forged by years of labor and patience, a man who valued honor above comfort, duty above vanity. Isabella's first glance at him was a mixture of disbelief and disdain. She could hardly fathom being bound in matrimony to a servant, someone whose life she had long regarded as beneath hers. Her mind raced with indignation. How could her parents do this? How could they believe this punishment would teach her anything? As the ceremony began, Isabella's discomfort deepened. She walked down the aisle with a posture that suggested both defiance and resentment, her eyes barely meeting those of the guests. Every word of the vows felt like a bitter pill, every gesture a reminder of her lack of control. When it came time to take Thomas as her husband, she did so mechanically, without warmth, without affection. The contrast between the composed serenity of Thomas and the storm of emotions swirling within her could not have been starker. He accepted her coolness with remarkable patience, his gentle words and steady gaze doing nothing to provoke anger, but everything to highlight her own emotional volatility. The marriage, though legally binding, began under a cloud of tension. Isabella immediately assumed her usual role of superiority, issuing instructions, questioning Thomas's methods, and finding fault in everything he did. Thomas, however, met her condescension with a quiet confidence that was neither intimidated nor resentful. He performed his duties with skill, kindness, and an almost imperceptible patience that frustrated her in ways she could not articulate. Every act of humility she was forced to display, whether helping set the table or addressing servants as equals, felt like a challenge to her identity. Yet Thomas's calm acceptance of his own position, his refusal to be provoked, slowly began to unsettle the rigid walls of her pride. Despite her anger and resentment, small cracks began to appear in Isabella's defiance. She noticed almost reluctantly Thomas's competence and composure. He spoke with clarity, acted with integrity, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with her flamboyant entitlement. The more she resisted, the more she observed that he was not merely a servant, but a man of substance, whose worth was measured not by wealth or status, but by character and heart. Each interaction, each minor conflict, began to sow seeds of awareness, challenging her preconceived notions of superiority and value. By the end of the day, Isabella retired to her chambers exhausted, not from the ceremony itself, but from the mental and emotional strain of being confronted with a reality she had never known. The marriage, intended as a punishment, had begun its work. While she was unwilling to admit it even to herself, the simple act of being forced into union with Thomas had planted the first seed of change, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift that would grow with each passing day. The arrogance that had defined her life now faced the first true test, and the woman who had once believed herself untouchable was beginning, unknowingly, the journey toward transformation. The morning after the wedding, Isabella awoke to a world she barely recognized. Gone were the silks, the grand balls, and the servants who had once anticipated her every whim. Though she still lived in the family estate, the daily rhythm of her life had shifted dramatically. No longer could she demand attention or issue commands with the certainty of obedience. Instead, she was now immersed in a life that required effort, cooperation, and humility, qualities she had never truly practiced. Thomas approached the morning quietly, his presence calm and unassuming. He did not scold or berate her for her previous arrogance, nor did he indulge her temper. Instead, he spoke with gentle authority, guiding her through the responsibilities she now faced as part of their shared household. From organizing the estate's day-to-day affairs to participating in chores she had long considered beneath her, Isabella was forced to confront tasks that challenged both her patience and pride. At first, she met these challenges with indignation. Sweeping the floors, tending the gardens, assisting in preparing meals all felt like humiliations, daily reminders that she no longer stood above the world as she once had. Yet Thomas did not treat her as inferior. His manner was always respectful, even when instructing her, offering subtle guidance rather than overt criticism. He showed her that dignity was not in status or wealth, but in the care and attention one devoted to every task, no matter how small. When she fumbled, he corrected her gently. When she became frustrated, he offered calm reassurance. Slowly, Isabella began to recognize the difference between his quiet competence and the hollow pomp she had once relied upon. This realization was both unsettling and unfamiliar. She had never encountered someone whose authority was rooted not in position, but in genuine ability and integrity. The first weeks were filled with friction. Isabella's instinct was to assert herself, to demand respect through her former status, but every attempt was met with polite, unwavering resistance. Thomas did not seek to humiliate her, but he would not bow to her pride. In social interactions with the household staff, he maintained a level of fairness and dignity that Isabella could not ignore. The staff, who had often cowered in her presence, now seemed to regard her with a quiet curiosity, noting her discomfort, but also observing Thomas's unwavering patience. These subtle shifts were jarring for Isabella, forcing her to reflect on the power dynamics she had long taken for granted. Despite her frustration, Isabella began noticing Thomas's qualities, his steadfastness, his reliability, and his empathy. She saw the respect he commanded from those around him, not because of wealth, but because he earned it through consistent integrity. Slowly, a reluctant admiration began to form, though she would never admit it aloud. Even in moments of tension, she found herself seeking his approval, noting the way he handled situations with care and foresight. Thomas, for his part, did not seek to exploit this shift, but continued to demonstrate patience, teaching her through example rather than reprimand. Gradually, Isabella began to participate more willingly in the household's routines. She discovered a sense of accomplishment in tasks she had once dismissed, and for the first time she began to appreciate the effort and skill involved in the work of everyday life. The initial humiliation she felt transformed into a quiet awakening, a realization that the world was not structured solely around her desires, and that respect and collaboration were earned through action, not assumed by birthright. By the end of this period, life with Thomas had begun to reshape her perspective. The heiress who had once demanded obedience was now learning to observe, listen, and adapt. Every shared task, every moment of guidance, and every demonstration of Thomas's unwavering character chipped away at her arrogance, laying the foundation for a transformation that would grow deeper with time. What had begun as a punishment was slowly evolving into an education, not only in humility, but in the values of patience, respect, and the true meaning of partnership. Isabella's world, once defined by privilege, was beginning to expand in ways she had never imagined. And though she did not yet recognize it, this was the first step on a journey that would forever alter the course of her life. It did not take long for Isabella's arrogance to collide with the reality of her new life. She had been resisting the changes with as much dignity as she could muster, but there came a moment that forced her to see, with painful clarity, just how fragile her position had become. That moment, her first true lesson in humility, came during a gathering at a neighboring estate. The occasion was modest compared to the glittering balls Isabella once attended, but it was nevertheless an important social event for the community. Farmers, tradesmen, and household staff mingled freely with a few landowners. Isabella arrived in a gown that, though simpler than her usual attire, still carried the air of refinement. She entered the gathering expecting at least a measure of admiration, certain that her beauty and poise would win her the same attention she had always commanded. But things did not unfold as she anticipated. Unlike the aristocratic circles she once ruled, this gathering was grounded in mutual respect and camaraderie. No one stopped to flatter her appearance or bow to her superiority. Instead, their admiration went toward Thomas, who was greeted warmly by nearly everyone present. Men shook his hand firmly, women smiled at him with respect, and younger boys sought his advice on matters of work and responsibility. Isabella watched in disbelief as her husband, a man she had considered beneath her, became the natural center of gravity in the room. Her frustration deepened when she attempted to assert herself in conversation. She spoke with the same haughty authority she had used all her life, making a comment about the struggles of farming that to her sounded witty. Instead, the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Her words revealed not sophistication but ignorance. A woman nearby gave her a pitying glance, while others quickly redirected the conversation away from her remarks. Isabella felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment, a rare and bitter sensation. It was Thomas who quietly salvaged the moment. With steady calm, he gently redirected the discussion, offering practical insights that eased the tension and drew laughter back into the circle. He did not correct Isabella publicly, nor embarrass her further. He simply shifted the spotlight away from her mistake with such grace that most people soon forgot her blunder. But Isabella did not forget. She sat in silence for the remainder of the evening, her pride wounded and her assumptions shaken. On the walk home, she stewed in her humiliation. Yet as much as she wanted to blame others for her discomfort, she could not escape the truth. She had been careless, dismissive, and blind to realities she had never needed to understand. Thomas, meanwhile, walked beside her in silence, his calm presence a reminder that he had nothing to prove. The contrast between them gnawed at her. That night, lying awake, Isabella reflected more honestly than she ever had before. She realized that admiration and respect did not come automatically with beauty or wealth. They were earned through deeds, through character, through the ability to uplift others rather than diminish them. For the first time, she saw her own shortcomings with a clarity that pierced through her pride. The lesson was painful, but it planted something new inside her, a flicker of awareness that perhaps she had much to learn. It did not erase her arrogance overnight, nor did it make her suddenly humble, but it cracked the foundation of her entitlement. From that moment forward, Isabella began to see Thomas not just as a servant-turned-husband, but as a man whose quiet dignity commanded respect in ways she had never managed. And deep down, though she fought the realization, she longed to understand how he did it. This was Isabella's first real lesson in humility. It would not be her last, but it was the beginning of a transformation she could no longer deny. After the sting of her humiliation at the gathering, Isabella began to move through her days with sharper awareness. She still carried her pride, but it no longer shielded her quite so completely. Now every interaction with Thomas seemed to weigh differently, as though she were seeing him through a new lens. And it was in the quiet, unassuming moments that the foundations of her arrogance began to shift. One of the first of these moments occurred on a brisk autumn morning. Isabella had been tasked with helping to wash linens. Her fingers, unaccustomed to the roughness of soap and cold water, quickly grew raw and tender. She fought against the task, scowling, trying to preserve her dignity as her hands fumbled clumsily. Thomas noticed but said nothing at first. When she finally let out a frustrated sigh, ready to abandon the work altogether, he stepped beside her. Without a word of criticism, he gently took her hands in his, showing her a better way to scrub without tearing the fabric or hurting herself. His touch was steady, his instructions soft. For a moment, Isabella's usual retorts caught in her throat. She realized he had no intention of mocking her. He simply wanted to help. It was a startling discovery. That kindness could come without judgment. Another moment came during an unexpected storm. Heavy rains pounded the countryside, and the roof of a small storage shed on the estate threatened to collapse. Thomas hurried outside to secure it, braving the wind and rain. Isabella, standing by the window, felt an unfamiliar tug of concern. For the first time, she did not see him as the servant husband, but as a man risking himself for the good of the household. She surprised herself by rushing out with a lantern, holding it steady as he worked so he could see through the storm. He thanked her afterward, water dripping from his hair, and the gratitude in his voice was so genuine that Isabella felt her chest tighten. She had done something small, yet it mattered. Then there was the evening she overheard him speaking with one of the younger stable boys. The child had broken a tool and feared punishment. Isabella, hidden in the shadows, expected Thomas to scold him. Instead, he knelt down, speaking gently. Mistakes are part of learning. What matters is how we fix them. He then showed the boy how to repair the tool, turning the mistake into a lesson. Isabella was struck by the tenderness in his voice, a tone she had never heard directed toward her in all her years of privilege. In that moment, she realized Thomas commanded loyalty not by fear as she often had, but by compassion. Each of these small moments unsettled her. For years, she had been taught that power lay in control, wealth, and appearance. Yet Thomas, with none of those things, held a quiet strength that drew respect more naturally than she ever had. Worse, Isabella began to feel something she had long dismissed as weakness: gratitude. She caught herself watching him, noticing the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the patience in his eyes, the care in his hands. These details, once invisible to her, now seemed to glow with significance. Her pride fought back, whispering that she should not soften, that he was still a servant, still beneath her. But another part of her, quieter, deeper, began to wonder if she had been wrong all along. Perhaps worth was not measured in titles or riches, but in the way one treated others. It was in these moments of unexpected kindness that Isabella's heart first began to bend. She would not admit it, not yet. But the walls she had built so high around herself were beginning to crumble, one gentle gesture at a time. The change between Isabella and Thomas did not happen overnight. It was gradual, like the slow turning of the seasons, noticeable only when one looked back and realized how far things had shifted. Where once every interaction was marked by tension, her pride clashing with his patience, there now began to emerge moments of harmony, surprising even Isabella herself. The turning point came when Thomas invited her to join him in tending the community garden. It was a project he had started long before their marriage, a plot of land shared among neighbors where families could grow vegetables together. Isabella resisted at first, claiming it was beneath her, but Thomas's quiet insistence and the genuine warmth of the villagers eventually pulled her in. To her surprise, the work was not as humiliating as she expected. Instead, it was grounding. For the first time in her life, she felt the soil between her fingers, the strain of bending to plant seeds, the satisfaction of seeing her effort produce something tangible. When an elderly woman thanked her for helping carry baskets of fresh produce, Isabella felt a flicker of something new, pride, but of a different kind. Not the shallow pride of being admired for beauty or wealth, but the deeper kind that came from being useful. Working side by side with Thomas, she began to see him not as her inferior but as her equal, someone whose strengths complemented her own. He had patience where she had quick wit. He had steady hands where she had restless energy. When a problem arose, such as a pest threatening the crops, Thomas would listen thoughtfully, while Isabella, drawing on her sharp mind, suggested solutions. To her surprise, he valued her ideas, never dismissing them simply because of her inexperience. That acknowledgment struck her deeply. For years she had been admired, but rarely had she been respected for her mind. Back at the estate, their partnership grew in other ways. Thomas began including Isabella in decisions about household management, teaching her about budgets, trade agreements, and the fair treatment of workers. At first, she balked at the complexity, but she soon discovered she had a talent for organization and negotiation. With his guidance, she helped resolve a dispute between two suppliers, using her charm and quick thinking in a way that brought real benefit rather than shallow praise. When Thomas thanked her afterward, his eyes warm with genuine respect, Isabella felt something shift inside her. She had not been mocked or belittled. She had been trusted, and she had risen to the occasion. It was in the small, unspoken exchanges that the change became most apparent. A glance across the dinner table that lingered a moment too long, a word of encouragement given softly, almost shyly, a shared smile when a task was completed well. They were no longer adversaries locked in a battle of pride and patience, but partners, learning to move together in rhythm. Isabella, once so accustomed to commanding obedience, found herself listening, truly listening, to Thomas. And he, who had always borne himself with humility, began to open his heart more freely, revealing thoughts and dreams he had never dared share before. For the first time, Isabella saw in Thomas not just a servant or even just a husband forced upon her, but a man whose values she admired, whose respect she wanted to earn. And Thomas, in turn, began to see in Isabella not merely the spoiled heiress he had been bound to, but a woman with intelligence, courage, and a capacity for growth that surprised him daily. Their relationship had not yet blossomed into love, but the soil was fertile. The sharp edges of resentment had been softened, replaced by a growing foundation of mutual respect. And respect, as Isabella was learning, was the true root of every meaningful bond. Respect had begun to grow between Isabella and Thomas, but it was the arrival of a crisis that truly revealed the depth of their characters and cemented the fragile bond forming between them. It came suddenly, in the form of a fire that broke out one dry summer evening. The flames started in one of the barns at the far end of the estate, likely sparked by a careless lantern left too close to the hay. Within minutes, the structure was ablaze, the fire threatening not only the animals inside, but also the surrounding fields. Panic rippled through the household. Servants ran frantically, some carrying buckets of water, others rushing to release the terrified livestock. Isabella, standing at the edge of the chaos, froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as smoke and heat engulfed the night air. She had never faced danger so directly before. Balls and banquets had not prepared her for this, the raw, terrifying reality of destruction. Thomas, however, did not hesitate. With a calm urgency, he shouted orders, his voice carrying authority that cut through the panic. He directed the men to form a line with water buckets, instructed others to lead the horses and cattle to safety, and then dashed straight into the barn to free the animals still trapped inside. Isabella watched in shock as he disappeared into the inferno. Every instinct told her he was risking his life, yet he did so without a moment's thought. It was in that moment, standing there with her lungs stinging from smoke, that Isabella made a choice she never would have imagined for herself. She grabbed her skirts, tied them up above her ankles, and rushed forward. She seized a bucket, joining the line of villagers and servants, passing water with hands that had once only held delicate fans or jeweled goblets. At first, the others stared in disbelief, Lady Isabella, the proud heiress, working alongside them. But there was no time for gossip. Her determination silenced their doubts, and soon they were fighting side by side. Minutes stretched like hours. Isabella's arms ached, her throat burned, but she refused to stop. Then, just as despair threatened to overtake her, Thomas emerged from the barn, his face streaked with soot, leading a calf by a rope. Behind him, the last of the animals stumbled out, coughing and frightened but alive. Relief surged through the crowd, but the fire was still raging. Together, Thomas and Isabella pushed the line of water closer, coordinating efforts until at last the flames began to die down. By dawn, the barn was reduced to blackened beams, but the fields and animals were safe. Exhausted, Isabella collapsed onto the grass, her gown torn and her hands blistered. She looked up to see Thomas standing over her, his eyes filled not just with pride but with something gentler. Gratitude, perhaps even admiration. He extended a hand, and she took it without hesitation. Their fingers, smeared with ash, locked together in silent acknowledgement of what they had faced. In that moment, Isabella saw him not just as a man of strength, but as a leader, someone who carried others through fear with courage and clarity. And Thomas, in turn, saw in her the beginnings of transformation, a woman who, when tested, did not shrink away but rose to the challenge, proving she was far more than her arrogance had once suggested. The fire had scarred the estate, but it had also forged something new between them. Where before there had been reluctant respect, now there was trust, a bond formed not in comfort but in shared struggle. And it was this bond, born of crisis, that laid the groundwork for a deeper connection neither of them could deny. The fire left more than just charred beams and smoke-stained fields. It left Isabella changed. For the first time in her life, she had faced real danger, real loss, and real work. And instead of shrinking from it, she had risen. That night replayed, in her mind for days afterward, the heat of the flames, the sound of frightened animals, the burn in her arms from carrying buckets, and most of all, the look in Thomas's eyes when he had reached for her hand. That look lingered, settling deep in her heart, more powerful than any compliment or token of admiration she had received in her gilded past. Isabella began to see her life differently. Where once she had strutted through the estate with disdain, she now walked with new eyes. She noticed the weary lines on the cook's face after long hours in the kitchen. She saw the care with which the stable boys tended to the horses, even in the early dawn cold. She heard the laughter of the maids as they worked together, a laughter born not from luxury but from companionship. All her life, she had dismissed such people as insignificant, but now she understood. They were the heartbeat of the estate. Without them, the grand halls and lush gardens would crumble into emptiness. Her attitude began to soften in ways that shocked even herself. One morning, she rose early to help with breakfast, chopping vegetables clumsily under the cook's watchful eye. At first, the staff exchanged bewildered glances, unsure whether to laugh or recoil. But Isabella persisted, ignoring her blisters and awkward mistakes. Slowly, they began to accept her presence, and a kind of tentative friendship grew. For Isabella, it was the first time she felt included in something real, not a glittering illusion of society, but a shared effort that bound people together. Her parents noticed the change too. They had expected her to resist, perhaps even to rebel outright, but instead, they saw their daughter becoming someone new. At dinners, she no longer filled the silence with self-centered chatter. Instead, she asked questions, listened to answers, and even praised Thomas openly for his work and leadership during the fire. At first, her parents were stunned, wondering if this was simply a temporary facade. But as the days turned to weeks, they could not deny the authenticity of her transformation. Isabella was no longer the spoiled heiress who sneered at those. Beneath her, she was becoming a woman capable of empathy, resilience, and respect. Perhaps the most profound shift came in her relationship with Thomas. Their conversations deepened, moving beyond instructions and polite exchanges. She asked him about his past, his dreams, his views on life. And he, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, began to share. He spoke of his childhood, the hardships he had faced, the satisfaction of building a life through honest work. Isabella listened, often moved to silence, realizing how narrow her own world had been. For the first time, she wanted not to command him, but to understand him. It was during one of these quiet talks, seated together after a long day of repairs, that Isabella confessed something that had weighed on her heart. "I thought I was better than everyone. I thought respect was something owed to me because of my birth. But I see now I was wrong." Her voice trembled, but she met his gaze firmly. "I don't want to be that woman anymore." Thomas did not respond with triumph or scolding. He simply nodded, his expression calm but softened by warmth. "Change doesn't happen all at once," he said gently, "but you've already started." That simple acknowledgement filled Isabella with a peace she had never known. For the first time, she felt truly free, not trapped by the expectations of wealth and status, but open to becoming someone better. She realized her worth no longer came from jewels or gowns, but from the strength of her heart and the respect she could earn through her actions. This was her transformation. The arrogant heiress was gone, and in her place was a woman humbled, strengthened, and ready to love. The change in Isabella had been gradual, like the slow turning of seasons. But when the transformation was complete, it was undeniable. The once proud heiress, who had scorned the very idea of being married to a servant, now walked through life with a new dignity, one that came not from wealth or breeding, but from character. The household, her family, and even the community beyond the estate could see it. The fire had been a turning point, but it was what followed that truly proved her change. Isabella continued to work alongside the staff, learning tasks she had once thought beneath her. She sewed torn garments, tended the garden, and even helped mend fences. Her hands, once soft and delicate, bore calluses, and her gowns no longer dazzled with jewels, but with practicality. Yet instead of shame, she wore this transformation as a badge of honor. The servants, who had once whispered mockingly about her arrogance, now began to speak with admiration. "She's not like she used to be," one maid confided to another. "She's one of us now." Respect, The very thing Isabella had always demanded but never truly earned was now freely given to her. Her parents were perhaps the most astonished of all. When they had arranged her marriage to Thomas, they had done so to humble her, to punish her for her haughty pride. They had expected resistance, tears, even disgrace. Instead, they found themselves witnessing a rebirth. Their daughter no longer viewed life as a stage upon which to parade her beauty and wealth, but as a shared journey of struggle, duty, and love. In quieter moments, her mother would glance at her with pride, while her father's stern demeanor softened, as though acknowledging that she had finally become the woman he had always hoped she might be. But it was in her relationship with Thomas that the truest resolution came. Where once there had been tension and distance, now there was warmth and companionship. They worked side by side, spoke long into the evenings, and most importantly, trusted one another. Isabella no longer looked down on him, and Thomas no longer kept her at arm's length. Instead, they found in each other a partnership born of mutual respect. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Thomas led her to a quiet spot overlooking the land. The air smelled of freshly cut hay, and the soft sound of crickets filled the silence between them. He turned to her, his expression steady but his eyes tender. "You've changed, Isabella," he said quietly. "Not for me. Not because of anyone else, but for yourself. And I've never admired anyone more." Her heart swelled at his words. In the past, she had received countless declarations of admiration, but none had touched her the way his did, because his was not based on her beauty, her wealth, or her family name. It was based on her soul, on the woman she had chosen to become. Tears glistened in her eyes as she replied, "I thought I was being punished when they married me to you. But now I see it was a gift. You've taught me what it means to be strong, to be humble, to be loved." For the first time, Thomas smiled fully, the guarded distance gone. He reached for her hand, not as a servant offering service, but as a man offering his heart. And she, without hesitation, took it. Their union, once mocked and pitied, became a source of inspiration. The townsfolk who had whispered behind their backs now looked upon them with admiration. The daughter of privilege and the man of humble birth had not only endured their forced marriage, but had turned it into something beautiful, a love that defied expectations and proved that true worth is not measured by wealth or rank, but by courage, kindness, and the ability to change. And so what began as a scheme to humble a spoiled young woman ended as a story of redemption and unexpected happiness. Isabella and Thomas, once bound by circumstance, were now bound by choice. Together, they stood not as mistress and servant, but as equals, partners in life, partners in love. The world had sought to humble her, but instead, it had given her the greatest gift of all, a heart transformed and a love that would last a lifetime.